OU is on the board for 2024. Welcome into the Voice of College Football, talking Sooners. Boomer to everybody out there. Please gather around, hit the like button before you get settled. We're going to talk Oklahoma football with all of you for the next 60 minutes or so. And of course, the guy that makes it all happen here is Jason Ray. Does our post-game shows here at the Voice of College Football, OU. And you got your Sooners colors on. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. How about yourself?
I'm good. Yeah, as I mentioned off the top, I got to say that about an hour ago or so, I did an LSU record and looked at their commitment list for 24. They had 11 hard commits. They're ranked second in the country. I don't know that anyone needs to panic because Oklahoma and Brent Venables brought in a great class. Of course, last year, a top 5 class in the nation. They're making a lot of inroads with particular players, and it's still 9 months away from National Signing Day, but they do get their first commit, and that's always a good thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's funny, Mark, how this kind of came to fruition. I think a lot of the guys that really, really follow recruiting and have some inside knowledge inside on the Oklahoma beat, a couple of them said this kid probably wouldn't have been, if you had to make me guess on, the guy that was in the first one, he probably wouldn't even have been in the top 10 as the first guy that I would have thought was committed. But Jeremiah Newcombe is the kid, defensive player on that defensive side of the ball, as you have here mentioned, number 3 overall Arizona, number 18 ranked cornerback in the country. So he's a 4-star guy, and I think Oklahoma fans would obviously love to hear the fact that, number one, it's a defensive guy. Number 2, this is a guy that USC was really, really heavily in on and really kind of leaning towards USC. So Oklahoma really made this happen very quickly, Mark. Oklahoma had this past weekend, they had a ton of kids on campus, 24, 25 kids as well. And he was one of them. And, he's one of those kids that was, I think, really just wowed by where Oklahoma's going, what Oklahoma has to provide, and exactly what that looks like for him and his family and his situation. So it came together a lot quicker. And as you mentioned at the top, Mark, I mean, I think this is something that we're going to continue to see. We saw this last year. There was concerns about this, I think, from a lot of Oklahoma fans last year, just related to the slow start that Oklahoma got. And so this is the mentality that Venables has. He wants these kids to know that they know that they know. This is where they want to be. They're not wanting to take other visits. And there's been a couple of kids that learned, and I don't want to necessarily say the hard way. So maybe they're fine with how that worked out. But there were a couple of kids that were committed to Oklahoma early, took some visits, and then Oklahoma backed off of them after that. So I think that's something that you're going to continue to see for Oklahoma. That they've got a few that have commitment dates that they're really strong on here in the late spring, early summer. What I would say a couple of June guys. So, but I think this will continue to be a trend. So I don't think it's anything to be alarmed about if you're an Oklahoma fan. I think this is just the way that this team in this program is recruiting now, and I think they're going to continue to recruit at a very high level.
We are open to your comments and questions as always here on Sooners Live, and we want to remind everyone that we come your way each week. Don't always know exactly what time we need to get together, but it's typically right here. We're hitting the mark most weeks. Wednesday, 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 a.m. Central. Jeremiah Newcombe, there it is, committed to Oklahoma out of Arizona. And Arizona increasingly becoming a better high school football playing state and being more prominent in the national recruiting rankings and bringing these kind of players to college football. All right, Jason, do we want to dive right into our wide receivers preview? We knocked out, folks, the running backs last week, quarterbacks the week before, so check out those videos. But we'd like to go through the wide receiver core at Oklahoma.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's certainly a good place to start. And I think when you look at the wide receivers specifically, and to a certain degree of the tight ends, I think it has to, you have to start at the top with what happened last year to begin the season with Cale Gundy being ultimately resigning his post there, and then Oklahoma really being in a tough spot and pulled in a guy in Damian Washington that was really an up and coming guy, but not sure that he was necessarily completely ready to be the wide receivers coach at a program like Oklahoma, but really was kind of thrust in the role and really didn't have another choice for Oklahoma at that point, Mark, when this happened so deep into the fall. I think it was, if I remember correctly, just a few weeks before the first game. So really didn't have an opportunity. So there was a little bit of got off to a little bit of a rocky start, I think, from that perspective. And so, Damian Washington has moved on. Oklahoma brought in Emmett Jones from, head coach at Texas Tech, head coach at Kansas. Really done a really good job at both of those places, developing some of those wide receivers. And I think, as you will see with a lot of the Venables hires and things like that, one, he's gonna bring in people that he's comfortable with. For one, I think two, he's gonna bring in people that really have a very big recruiting footprint. And so Emmett Jones is one of those guys that's really big in the Dallas area. So I think it's an area that Oklahoma that has traditionally been really solid in, maybe not as much as of recent, but I think that's something that's going to change. So in terms of on the field production, obviously you start with the loss of Marvin Mims, who was unquestionably the best receiver on the team, one of the best receivers in the Big 12 and in the country overall, is gone. 1,000-yard receiver a year ago, and then also you look at the tight end position when you look at Braden Willis, a guy who got the most volume of catches and touches from that tight end position. So again, much like we kind of talked about from a running back perspective, you've got a guy there that got a bulk of your catches, a bulk of your targets, that will obviously end up moving to a certainly that will come to a different person or committee per se this year. So I think you have to start with the guy that Oklahoma feels is going to need to step up in a big way in terms of being that number one guy. When you talk about Jalil Farouk, as you got here, 52 catches. I believe that's the column that we're looking at in catches and yards. 52 catches, 606 yards, 5 touchdowns a year ago. Was a guy, Mark, that was a little bit interesting. A lot of people thought that he might have been the guy that would move on and go with Caleb Williams over to USC, but stuck it out with Oklahoma. Had a really solid year, and I think he's the guy right now, kind of off the cuff, that's going to be expected to a certain degree to be that number one guy. So it'll be interesting to see how he goes in that role. And I think, Mark, I think probably there's a bigger level of concern for the wide receiver group overall than there is probably any other group on the offensive side of the ball. And I think it's primarily around just not a lot of production from that group that's returning outside of Jalil Farouk and Drake Stoops. Those are the two guys that are kind of mainstays over the last couple of years. 466 yards from, as you mentioned here, for Jalil Farouk, 393 and 39 catches for Drake Stoops. So pretty similar in production, both different, certainly vastly different wide receivers, but very similar in production. So I think where Oklahoma's at right now, and you want to be in a position where Drake Stoops can't be your number one or number two wide receiver. He is he does a fantastic job at doing what he does, and he runs great routes, catches the ball really, really well, has great hands, has the ability to get first downs, but he's not always necessarily going to be a game breaker. So I think Oklahoma's looking for some of these kids, Mark, that have that were freshmen last year. Some of these kids that haven't had a lot of production. step up. So I think there's 3 names that came in last year, whether it be a freshman or transfer, that I think they're going to look for some big things out of. I think first and foremost, Jaden Gibson is a guy that played a decent amount last year, just really didn't make a whole lot of plays. You know, really has a lot of good size, 6'4", 6'5" guy that has the ability to go up and get the ball. But I think that's a guy that Oklahoma is going to rely on, going to need to have really a high level of production this year. Nick Anderson's another guy that really was very, very impressive, from a scout team perspective last year, but he's a guy that's going to need to play a lot and to provide some valuable time at that wide receiver position. And then JJ Hester's another guy that had a pretty decent year for Missouri the year before, but really never got into the mix last year with Oklahoma. So he's that other guy that will need to be productive. And so I think the big newcomer right now, and I think it remains to be seen, Mark, whether Oklahoma goes a little bit deeper in the transfer portal, kind of post spring game for a wide receiver. Andrew Anthony is the only one that Oklahoma really got in that transfer portal from Michigan. And I think one of the things that were, I think most people remember him a couple of years ago with that long touchdown reception that he had against Michigan State, but really didn't have a ton of production outside of that. So Oklahoma's looking to him to be kind of more of that deep threat that they had with Marvin Mims over the last couple of years. Jalil Ferg does that to a degree, but I think they're looking at that, obviously that deep threat that can consistently break down the defense from that perspective. So heard good things about him early on. Not anything, wowing, but heard some solid things about him early on. And I think the one thing that will be very interesting to watch through spring and fall is going to be DJ Graham. I think a lot of people know him from the defensive side of the ball, moved to wide receiver really towards the end of last year, Mark. And so it'll be how he takes to that. Lincoln Riley recruited him as a wide receiver when he came to Oklahoma. That's where he wanted him to play. Felt like there was a little bit more of a need in the defensive secondary. He started for a while, then had just a really rough bowl game against Oregon the last year, and then was good at times, inconsistent at times last year. Then decided to move him over. So it has a lot of good ball skills, really athletic, tons of speed. So how he takes to that position will be very interesting at the wide receiver spot. And then as you kind of move over to the tight end, a little bit a familiar face comes back with Austin Stogner, who had went to South Carolina for years and decided to come back to Oklahoma this year. He'll come in as really probably the number one tight end, coming in the spring, and then as you move into fall. But another transfer, Blake Smith from Texas A&M, excuse me, is another guy that will play. He's more of a blocking tight end than he is a receiving, but certainly can do both. So those are probably the top 2 guys on the depth chart, and I think Oklahoma knows what they have from Austin Stogner, and it's just his ability to kind of learn this offense, and just because it's obviously a bit different than what he was used to when he was at Oklahoma previously. I think Caden Helms is another guy that has a lot of raw talent. Didn't as a freshman last year, played very, very sparingly, but another year in the system, another year in spring ball, certainly will help him and his body being in the right spot. So that'll be interesting to see how that kind of manifests as you look at that tight end position. But I think overall, as I mentioned, a lot of I'm just going to use the word cautious optimism on kind of this wide receiver position. Just a lot of guys that haven't made a lot of plays, haven't produced a lot outside of Farouk and Drake Stoops, and looking for that production to come in that group, with the hole that both Marvin Mims and Braden Willis left.
So, Jason, a lot of attention is given to Dylan Gabriel, and maybe the criticism being that he's not the Oklahoma standard that was established late under Bob Stoops. Well, really going back 15 years under Bob Stoops, or 20 years, in terms of the long line of Oklahoma quarterbacks, all the way through that Heisman run of Mayfield and Murray and Hurts as a finalist, that he's not in that realm. But when we flip it to the wide receiver production, it also doesn't seem like they have signed the likes of a Hollywood Brown or a CeeDee Lamb or anybody of that ilk in several recruiting cycles.
No, yeah, you're exactly right, Mark. And I think that's one of the concerns, that you've seen out of this Oklahoma team, particularly last year, but in the last couple of years, as you mentioned, that there's just not, outside of Marvin Mims, that there just doesn't look like there's a game changer. There's a difference maker at the wide receiver position, and specifically to your point, Mark, the guys that you'd mentioned, around Hollywood Brown, CeeDee Lamb, and some of those guys that's really been a difference maker at the position. And as a quarterback, you're only as good as your skill position and your offensive line allow you to be. So I think that's a valuable point. These kids are, I think these kids are really, really talented. Both Nick Anderson and Jaden Gibson are 4-star guys that come. JJ Hester is a guy that was very highly recruited as well. So you've got a lot of, obviously you've got a lot of highly recruited kids that have come into the program, but I think it's time. And I think with where Oklahoma is in terms of what they didn't necessarily bring in from the transfer portal, I think it lends maybe to a certain degree of confidence that the coaching staff feels like, at least now through spring ball, they're going to give these guys a chance to see what they can do before they decide maybe if something different needs to happen post spring as you go into fall.
Talking Sooners here at the Voice of College Football. And as we have posted here on the screen, join our Discord. You can talk Oklahoma. You can talk college football all the time. Go to patreon.com, search MarkRogersTV, and you can sign up right there. And again, college football talk 24/7, 365 all the time. So out of this recruiting weekend, it's always difficult to draw any kind of conclusions from that, because everybody seems to have a great time, and everyone, it's extremely rare to hear one of these recruits say that they had a bad time or give some kind of indication on social media that they didn't, that they were disappointed about the visit. But, is there any, what do you expect to be the returns on some of these recruiting visits? I would say that with only one commit, that don't they typically have a number of recruiting visit weekends, big weekends coming up like late May into June? And then I would think that in the next 6 weeks after that would be, some commitments would roll in after that.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, Mark. Just in terms of your first question, I haven't really heard a whole lot in terms of any pending commitments coming from this weekend. As I mentioned, there's a couple of guys. Michael Hawkins is one. There's a couple of other kids that are really between Oklahoma and another a couple of other schools that have set some commitment dates in the June and July timeframe. But I think, as you'd mentioned, Oklahoma has this was one of the bigger ones that they had that kind of came together this past weekend. So we'll see what dividends that provides. But I think to your point, typically, and I don't have a date for this, usually June or July, there is a really big, I believe it's in June, Oklahoma has that big Champ U barbecue which is a huge recruiting weekend for them as well. And I think last year Oklahoma got quite a few commitments after that. After that recruiting event, so that's one where Oklahoma really certainly goes all in on from a recruiting perspective there. So certainly would expect to see some in between now and then, and certainly some that happen after that. And the one thing, as we just very quickly going back to the wide receiver position, there was one kid that I failed to mention. He's not going to be in for the spring. He'll be in for the fall. Jaquays Pettaway was a big time recruit that they got this year. 4-star kid, number 14, ranked receiver nationally. He's a guy that is a little bit smaller in nature, 5'11", 170, but he's a speed guy. So I think it'll be very interesting to see once he gets in to see how coming into the fall, he's a little bit more of a puts him behind schedule just a little bit, but he's another guy that Oklahoma will bring into the fold that potentially. I think a lot of people think that he's a guy that could play as a freshman, specifically if some of the other guys that we'd mentioned don't necessarily pan out and don't put themselves in a position to be one of those guys after spring ball. After spring ball ends.
So in terms of anything from spring practice, and this is always the the elusive topic just in regards to any college football team spring practice, because there's only so much access or anything coming out. But have you been able to gather anything from what's going on there?
There's not a ton just yet. I think there is a lot of, again, there's a lot of, I'll continue to say this word probably throughout the spring and fall, a lot of cautious optimism on the wide receiver. I think Jalil Farouk and Nick Anderson are two guys that I've seen that have been singled out as guys that continue to do and play, perform really, really well here early on in spring ball. And things like that. I heard Jaden Gibson is a guy that and again last year he made a lot of plays, but he was very raw. And so I think you take that a little bit with a little bit more, maybe a little less of a grain of salt than maybe you did last year, understanding that his body has probably started to develop a little bit into what they like. And Emmett Jones is a guy that loves the big wide receivers. Andrew Parchment is a guy that he had from Kansas, and then there was a couple of other kids from Texas Tech. So he likes the bigger, taller wide receiver. So he's a guy, I think, that if he continues to play well, he'll find himself getting at least more opportunities, I think, Mark, than perhaps he did a year ago. And so, I think in as you look, I think one of the things that Emmett Jones really does a good job of, and I think offensively overall, is no matter how good some of these kids maybe come in, how touted they are, they make them earn their spots immediately. Like, for example, Andrew Anthony is a guy, he's running with the threes right now. He may not necessarily be a third team wide receiver, but he has to prove it over some of these guys that maybe have been here a little bit longer. Jackson Arnold is another guy. Like right now, he's running as a 3 behind Davis Bevel. I mean, I think we all understand that it's very unlikely that Davis Bevel will win the backup quarterback position over Jackson Arnold. But I think there's a certain degree that you want to try, especially these highly recruited kids. You want to maybe humble them just a little bit and make them earn and make them work really, really hard early on, and things like that. So I think there's, this time of the year is very, very, I think, difficult to decipher when you hear notes. Is it truly what they feel, or is it what people are wanting to see happen? And they're kind of like, almost like creating that, desire for this team to be good or this player to be good. But I think there is the sentiment that I would go with, Mark, and that I continue to hear more and more is that the coaches, the players, the staff, everyone inside that program is incredibly embarrassed um, on how this season went last year. And so I think there is from in some of the clips that I saw, you're seeing some of these kids, and I wouldn't say they're getting into fights, but there's some skirmishes going on early on this year that you didn't necessarily see maybe at this time. And so I think there's a lot of passion, obviously, on both sides of the ball. So I, I've heard a couple of quotes from players, and obviously I've heard, we had talked about this last week, Mark, in terms of some of the discussion points that Venables provided in his press conference related to the defense being on another planet and just overall. So I think the entire team is really kind of taking and understanding that 6-7 in Oklahoma is, nowhere near acceptable, nowhere near the bar, nowhere near the standard. And so, we'll see how that continues to play out through spring and fall. But I think there certainly is a level of frustration, embarrassment, and anger towards, what happened last year. And if they can, put this together, to essentially allow this season to not be anywhere at the same level that it was last year, uh, will be very, I think, critical, for the program, and not for just the kids, but the program going into the SEC in a couple of years.
Switching back primarily to the offense, and we just ran through what is somewhat of an underwhelming wide receiver core outside of some of the newcomers that could, uh, move their way up the depth chart and explode. And looking at a quarterback who, again, is capable, he's good, but he's not up to what the standard has been there. We know that the offensive line was arguably one of the best in college football. Not arguably one of the best, was arguably the best, and definitely one of the best in college football for several years running. That there seems to be a downgrade in all these positions still. And of course, Kennedy Brooks lost 2 years ago. Then the Eric Gray loss this past season as the number one running back, and that being the one position where it looks like there are stars in the making, with Javante Barnes in particular, Gavin Sawchuk as well. But this is still an offense that, considering Dylan Gabriel missed the entire Texas game, and that was just a complete train wreck from the quarterback position, that they couldn't generate anything. And he was lost, at one point in the TCU game, and that got away from them, that they still generated an offense that was 13th in the country in yards per game at 474. That, again, when I look at the standard versus what they have at some of these positions, I don't see them being what they've been, but they still had a really productive year on offense, everything considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Mark, I think so. A couple of things come to mind as I kind of pose your thought there. For one, I think the thing that this team, I think a lot of the staff had come in, and I think it was primarily true on the defensive side of the ball, but also on the offensive side to a certain degree. I think the coaching staff was a little bit surprised at the lack of talent, athleticism on both sides of the ball, particularly on defense, but both sides of the ball to a certain degree. And so I think that was something early on this this staff realized, that the recruiting has to be better. It has to be very specific. Everything around the program has to be better. So to get this program back to where to where it needs to be, year in and year out. So, but I think the second part of that is there's a lot of I love the Oklahoma fan base, obviously born and bred as an Oklahoma guy, but there are, I think, and this comes in all sports, but there are just unrealistic expectations that's put very specifically on this football program. I think year in and year out, and the expectation is, and I've seen this before. I mean, already early on this year, like there's some people that have realistic expectations that this is a national championship caliber team, and so and when I say that, Mark, I think if Oklahoma's not scoring 40 and 50 points a game, what's wrong? What's wrong with the quarterback? What's wrong with the receivers? What's wrong with the offensive coordinator? I don't know how many times we we would have post game conversations with. I don't think Lebby is the answer. I don't think we need to. Wouldn't be surprised, or I wouldn't be had my feelings hurt if he decided to move on next year. And so when you look at that and you put that and you completely paint that picture, Mark, as we talked about, with the talent not being at the level that it's been with with the Bakers, with the Jalen's, with the Kyler Murray's, and with all of that group, and still being able to put together the 13th best offense in the country, I think shows how good of an offensive coordinator and how good of a mind Jeff Lebby has. So as you see that talent begin to increase, you see what dividends the strength and conditioning program will continue to prove when you see the development of some of this talent that Oklahoma is going to bring in. The hope and desire um, is that it would continue to get better and continue to get to that level. And I think what we saw this year a lot, Mark, is what we didn't necessarily see as much of, under those Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks, is one that you alluded to: great wide receivers, really really good offensive line play, elite offensive line play, where Oklahoma could absorb some turnovers. Oklahoma could absorb a game where you know they're they've got they're converting 3 out of 15 third downs. They could absorb some things like that. But what we saw this year with a quarterback that's not quite as good, obviously not a horrible quarterback, but not as good at the level of those Heisman Trophy winners, and you've seen a new system and things like that happening, that Oklahoma wasn't as in a good position to be able to absorb things like that. They couldn't absorb turnovers. They couldn't absorb injuries. They couldn't absorb things, going bad, not being as prolific as they need to be. And that's, in a certain degree, that's in the games that Oklahoma struggled to score at a high level. That's, I think that's what happened, accompanied with, certainly, with the defense. So I think, and I think the one thing that Oklahoma people should be, fans and supporters should be, I think, fired up about, is the fact that how many coordinators would you see across the country when Nick Saban calls that you don't even want to interview, not even interview. So I think the fact that he shut that down, and he talked about early on in spring that this is the place that he wants to be. And so I think there's a little bit of slack that obviously you got to give him in his first year, and knowing that beyond something crazy, like he's going to be the offensive coordinator at Oklahoma until he gets a head coaching job that he wants, right? So there's a lot of cloud, and obviously there's a lot of expectations that come with this position, but there's a lot of certainly a lot of guys that have been the offensive coordinator at Oklahoma have went on to great things. You got Kevin Wilson now, who's now the head coach at Tulsa. You've got Lincoln Riley, obviously, that elevated to the head coach and then moved on to USC. So you've got a lot of guys that have used, and I say the word use, that's probably not the right word, but have had the opportunity at Oklahoma as that offensive coordinator, and it sprung them into a head coaching job. So I think you're going to see a lot of improvement. I think overall with this offense this year, if nothing else, just a second year in the system and a second year under the coaching of Lebby, and then I think Emmett Jones is going to bring a lot to this offensive staff as well.
All right, folks, we talk Oklahoma football with all of you each and every week. Appreciate you being here. If you missed some of the show, all you need to do is wait for the video to post, and you can watch what you missed and make it on back next week. We will, of course, keep everyone abreast of when those times are, but start with 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central on Wednesday, and we will keep our nose to the grindstone on recruiting, and we will bring you another positional breakdown. We'll go to the offensive line next week. That makes sense, Jason?
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, we'll do some offensive line next week for everyone, and hopefully more to talk about as well. Jason, anything else that you wanted to hit on?
No, I think the one thing that I would say is Oklahoma, as you look at this spring, I know a lot of times we talk about football and we talk about sports, but there's a human side of this, and just want to acknowledge, and I don't know if this is something that you had heard. So Peyton Bowen is a guy for Oklahoma that has, his recruitment was wild. We talked about him probably more than any other recruit in Oklahoma's cycle, and it was even more crazy how it went on signing day with him. Oregon, and flipping to Oklahoma last minute. But he had he was not at practice for a couple of days, and it kind of, there was some concerns about, okay, what's going on with him. But he unfortunately had a death in the family. His I believe it, and I hope I'm not saying this wrong. I believe it was his sister was giving birth, and she died during that. And so just prayers out to him and the family. And obviously we know sometimes this is bigger than football, bigger than sports and things. These kids go through real challenges. And I think a lot of times we just see the football player, we see the athlete, we see the the guy representing, guy or girl in whatever sport it is, representing that, representing the program on Saturdays. But there's a real human element to that. And so, and I think if you guys, there's been a ton of Sooner support over that, but I think he had tweeted out a GoFundMe for some stuff related to what's going on. So go check out his Twitter handle, and then there's some stuff on there that you can go support him and his family in that manner.
Yeah, so we want to do this justice here. So, yes, thoughts and prayers for Peyton Bowen. And I did not hear about that. I'm looking at the tweet that was sent out. We can post that on the screen here in a second. Yeah, it says, "Hey everyone, Saturday morning, my family and I lost my sister after she gave birth to my niece, Josephine Louise. It's been a very hard time for everyone who has had a relationship with my sister." Yeah, so that's about as difficult as it gets in regards to just thinking about a young lady who has lost her life, of course, and then on top of that, we now have a child in the world who will not have her mother, and so yeah, just a devastating loss there, and kind of unthinkable for just really any of us, but especially those of us who have children and have had a wife or significant other and all of that, and a sister. So we can all relate to that. I'm sure it's to some degree, but wow, that's horrible.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And so all thoughts and prayers go out to Peyton and their family right now for sure.
So again, as Jason mentioned, you can go to Peyton Bowen's Twitter and find a GoFundMe because obviously his whatever the family dynamic there with his sister, but he has a niece now that needs to be cared for, and a lot to deal with there. So that is a difficult situation for sure. Well, Jason, thank you so much for bringing that to our attention because that's certainly more important than everything else we talked about. And it brings to light, yeah, that these guys are more than football players. I reviewed what Matt Rule's news conference was the other day, and he wasn't even speaking to anything important like that, but just talking in general that these football players, they have families, they have significant others, they have their academics, they have interests outside of football, whether that's cooking, gardening, whatever it is, music and other things. And so, we just know them with the headgear on and the number slapped on their back. And certainly there's a lot of benefits and privileges that they receive because of how good they can play football. But then there's also a downside and a responsibility in things that are placed on them that are not placed on most. I'm not going to say all because there are a lot of situations out there, but placed on many, 18, 19, 20-year olds that they have to deal with. So,
Yep. Well said.
all right, Jason, thank you so much for that. And thanks for being here as always. Again, we want to invite everyone to check out what you missed as we wrap up the show here. The video will post. Check out what you missed and make it on back next week as we talk offensive line and everything else that involves Oklahoma football. Jason, thanks so much. We'll see everybody back here next week.